Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Social Problems. Today we're going to talk about the concept of social problems, and we'll chat about how sociologists understand and address social problems in society. A social problem is a social condition or pattern of behavior that is believed to warrant public concern and collective action. Social problems provide a clear link between individual or private troubles and larger public issues. For example, you might consider drug addiction as a very individual thing, that it manifests at the level of the individual and causes a person hardship, harm, or trauma. But it also manifests at the societal level. Think of how drug addiction intersects with the health system, with the workplace, the criminal justice system, the economy, and so on. Or you might consider the example of vaccinations in the context of a public health emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly the decision to get vaccinated is an individual one, but it has much broader social consequences that can impact others. So-called herd immunity, by example, may be difficult if folks choose not to get vaccinated. Or one person's decision to not get vaccinated may put others around them at increased risk. Therefore, vaccine hesitancy would be classified as a social problem rather than an individual one. Throughout the chapter, you are urged to practice what is called a sociological imagination, as you move between taking a sort of micro-sociological perspective, or a perspective that focuses on the individual as a unit of analysis, and macro-sociological perspective, a perspective that focuses on the structural issues and societal issues that stem from individual troubles. The sociological imagination is a term first used by sociologist C. Wright Mills to describe the sociologist's ability to connect large-scale public issues to people's personal experiences, and therefore analyze the patterns of personal experience that exist at the societal level. It is perhaps the first tool that sociologists take out in their toolbox to explore the world. It is our ability to recognize that personal troubles are not simply individual, but also reflect broader issues in society more generally. As part of your read, watch, and respond for this topic, I want you to use course material to answer the following question in one paragraph. In your own terms, what is the difference between a micro-sociological perspective and a macro-sociological perspective? Use an example not mentioned in the textbook or in this lecture to demonstrate your knowledge of each. So just pause it here. This chapter focuses on how social problems are constructed through shifting values and norms, and how this is an illustration of the social construction of social problems. Values are the things or ideas that we believe are important to the way we live. For example, a value within the labor market is dependability and hard work. Norms, on the other hand, are rules and expectations of the society pertaining to appropriate behaviors under various social circumstances. For example, if we're sitting today in a classroom and you were listening to me give my lecture, you would likely not get up in the middle of class and scream at the top of your lungs, would you? Hopefully the answer is no, and in part that is due to the fact that you have been socialized with a particular set of norms in mind that condition your everyday behavior. This happens in almost all contexts. How you act in front of your friends is likely very different than how you act when you visit your relatives, isn't it? How you behave in front of a professor is likely different than how you behave at a bar. When you're driving down the street and you notice a police car in your rearview mirror, I bet you put down your cell phone, you slow down, and you likely put both of your hands on your steering wheel. This is all because you have internalized a variety of norms throughout your life that change the ways in which you behave in any given situation. But how are these values and norms conditioned? Well, some sociologists suggest that moral entrepreneurs and the process of claims making play an important roles in how social problems are framed and addressed in societies. The concept of moral entrepreneurs, first coined by sociologist Howard Becker in his book Outsiders, describes people who discover and try to publicize so-called deviant behaviors, or behaviors that violate established norms. A moral entrepreneur is an individual or group that explicitly seeks to influence people to adopt or maintain an established norm. Perhaps the most famous examples of this are the Mothers Against Drunk Driving group, who have lobbied for increased regulation of alcohol, or the competing pro-life and pro-choice movements that seek to influence the adoption or shift of established norms regarding reproduction rights, or even the competing pro- and anti-vaccination groups seeking to influence established norms regarding public health measures. For your read, watch, respond, I want you to use the textbook and the video to answer the following question in one paragraph. Describe a situation or an issue in which moral entrepreneurs have tried to influence people to adopt or maintain an established norm. Who are the moral entrepreneurs? Who are they trying to influence? And how are they trying to influence others? So pause the video here and answer that question. These individuals and groups influence our established norms through a process that sociologists call claims making. Claims making can perhaps be best defined as the promotion of a particular moral vision of social life, and thus anything people do to propagate a view of who or what is a problem and what should be done about it. In other words, the process of claims making is actually a type of social activity that individuals or groups do to make more or less legitimate assertions about the reality of any given situation. How do we define something as a problem? Well, we do so through claiming some sort of assertion or grievance about it. We define it as a problem. And we claim that something is a problem through a process of making assertions about it that are more or less grounded in some sort of empirical evidence, whether that is valid or reliable evidence or not. Consider the example of climate change. There are moral entrepreneurs on both sides making claims about the validity of climate change as a social problem. Each group present their assertions for folks who then define it as a social problem or not. We can then use those assertions to establish or not climate change as an issue in need of some sort of solution. Let me be clear for a moment. The evidence is overwhelming that climate change is real and we must do something about it. So you can see that some claims to social problems are much more valid and reliable than others. In this way, through analyzing the claims-making process, sociologists have been successful in identifying both illegitimate claims and claims that are the result of what are called moral panics. A moral panic can be defined as a process of arousing social concern over false beliefs that a named people of group, most often actually a racialized or marginalized group, poses a menace or threat to society and is typically accomplished by moral entrepreneurs and the mass media. Think of the moral panic that was created after the events of 9/11, where we saw social anxiety about Muslims increase even though the FBI has consistently found that the threat of right-wing nationalism is far greater. Or consider the example of responses to the COVID-19 outbreak and the rise of anti-Asian sentiment across North America. Neither of these two groups present a threat to the well-being of society, and yet there is a social panic about them. This results in a variety of harmful consequences, including increased violence and hate crimes targeting marginalized groups, stigmatization of entire groups of people, and the promotion of white supremacy and systemic racism. The job of the sociologist, then, is to analyze the process through which certain claims are successful in defining social problems and thus establishing new or maintaining social norms, and which are not. In doing this, sociologists work to differentiate between so-called real social problems and those that are socially constructed, and then how those social problems provide the impetus for collective action, whether from the general public in the form of social movements, or authorities like governments through social policy and public policy. So as part of your read, watch, and respond for this topic, I want you to pause the video and answer the following question in one paragraph. How can you determine if a social problem is real or not? What do you think are some of the implications of some of social problems being labeled as real while others are not? Use any example you'd like in your read, watch, and respond. Mental health, substance abuse, climate change, terrorism, or anything else you can think of. So pause the video and go ahead and do that. The chapter also explores how social problems can be understood through various theoretical perspectives. In doing so, it emphasizes the importance of recognizing that social problems cannot be fully understood through a single theoretical lens. The theoretical perspectives that are introduced in this chapter are structural functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, feminist theory, social constructivism, postmodernism, and post-structuralism. Structural functionalism is a theoretical model most often associated with French sociologist Émile Durkheim that highlights the way each institution works to fulfill the needs of society as a whole. Often referred to simply as functionalism, it is a macro-sociological approach that focuses on the social level as opposed to the individual level. It is a framework that sees society as an incredibly complex system of interconnected parts that work together to promote solidarity, cohesion, and social stability. Just like the body is made up of a series of functional systems, the heart, the lungs, the brain, that rely on each other for proper functioning as a whole. If you take one of society's parts out, for example, the labor force, the entire system would become unstable. The economy would falter, and society would become destabilized as a result. For functionalists, each system in society has a specific function that relies on and is associated with other systems. When these systems function, it leads to social stability and social cohesion, or closeness to the particular society. On the other hand, dysfunction in one or more systems leads to social instability. Both functions and dysfunctions can be latent or manifest. Manifest functions or dysfunctions are deliberate and known. For example, the manifest function of the education system is knowledge translation. I am hopefully teaching you lessons that enable and enhance your own learning. That is an intended function of this class and university more generally. Latent functions or dysfunctions, on the other hand, are unintended and or go unrecognized by many. In this same example, a latent function of the education system may be matchmaking, as under normal circumstances and when we're not in this Zoom university, many folks meet their long-term partners at university and go on to live long and healthy lives with those partners. Another latent function of education would be to increase your social network, to increase your friend group. Think of your current peer group. How many go to King's or Western? Dysfunctions can also be manifest or latent. While manifest or latent functions in society have a positive effect on social stability, dysfunctions have some sort of negative effect on social stability. And this is negative not in a moral sense, like those are evil functions, but more of a negative analytical effect in that they disrupt order and social stability. Consider the example of a massive concert like Tomorrowland or Osheaga. A manifest function, or an intended and expected consequence, might include disruptions of transportation in the area and the production of massive amounts of excess garbage that negatively impacts the functioning of the local ecosystem. These might lead to social dysfunction, even if temporary, but they are also to be expected. A latent dysfunction of such a concert might be that a mass number of folks miss work the next day as the result of going a little bit too hard, causing a disruption in the local economy. If a concert were to be held in the context of a global pandemic, a latent dysfunction might also be the spread of a deadly virus like COVID-19. These latent dysfunctions are more difficult to anticipate and build into proper system functioning. In this way, latent dysfunctions can be even more challenging for social stability. A number of scholars have built on the structural functionalist tradition in other areas of society. Criminologist Robert Merton, for example, developed a theory of deviance derived from Durkheim's idea of anomie, or a state of normlessness that is caused by system dysfunction, that suggests that individuals have 5 modes of adaptation when faced with anomie, and that these modes of action determine how individuals will act in those situations. We'll return to Merton's ideas in our lecture on crime and deviance in Chapter 6. Conflict theory is a theoretical model drawn from the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that highlights how conflict between groups is both a regular feature of society and a cause of social change. Perhaps best characterized as a group of conflict theories rather than just a single theory, this perspective emphasizes what is called a materialist view of history, that history must be understood as a result of material conditions of society rather than the ideals of such a society. To do that, conflict theorists tend to argue for a dialectical method of analyzing society. That is, in order to understand society, we must first take a critical stance towards the material conditions of that society in order to reform it. We must seek to change the existing social arrangements that have resulted in conflict between groups. This is where we get Karl Marx's famous saying of the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. In advanced capitalist societies like we live, for example, we must take a critical approach to the social conditions that have caused class conflict between groups based on socioeconomic differences. For Marx and others, capitalism inevitably produces conflict between groups that would ultimately lead to its own destruction, a prediction that, as we know, is yet to fully manifest. For conflict theorists, analyzing society is about analyzing conflict between groups of people, most often, but not exclusively, along class conflict lines. Feminist theory is an extension of conflict theory that aims to explicitly understand the nature of gendered inequality as a dominant mechanism of social conflict. Better characterized as a group of theories rather than one theoretical perspective, feminist theories have historically examined the role of patriarchy in structuring the social system. Patriarchy can best be defined as a form of social organization that follows a long history in which fathers, or more generally the oldest males, or more generally still men, are the heads and rulers of the household, community, and society. It is a social system that is built on the historical idea that society should be run like a household in which men are the authority figure. And feminists have, rightfully so, critiqued the social structure for being constructed upon such historical ideals, and have empirically dominated the harms and the problems associated with this. These folks have documented the ways in which women have been subjugated and systematically disempowered by men throughout every social institution, and illuminated the ways in which this interacts with other forms of subjugation. More contemporary conflict theorists have moved away from class as the central unit of analysis in lieu of intersectional analyses of race, gender, sexuality, ability and disability, nationality, and so on, which highlight how a person's social categorizations manifest in different modes of discrimination, oppression, and privilege. We'll return to this question or these questions when we discuss decolonization and social problems. So I'd like you to stop the video here. As part of your read, watch, respond for this topic, I want you to answer the following question in one paragraph. What would structural functionalists and conflict theorists say about the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences? Feel free to take this in any direction you want. There's not really a right or wrong answer here. So pause the video and go ahead and do that. Contrasting both conflict theory and structural functionalism, which both focus on the structure of society more than they do on the agency of individuals, symbolic interactionism is a theoretical paradigm that studies the process by which people interpret and respond to the actions of others. Symbolic interactionists conceive of society as the product of this continuous face-to-face interaction. Unlike conflict and functionalism, which are macro sociological perspectives, symbolic interactionism is an explicitly micro sociological approach that focuses on people and small groups. This perspective focuses on how individuals and groups in society use and interpret shared dialect, language, symbols, signs, and modes of communication to make sense of the world and to interact with one another. These symbolic worlds that we ourselves construct then in turn shape the individual behaviors of actors therein. For example, think of how newborns see the world, lights and sounds that are not easily understood. Certainly, there's some cognition of lightness from darkness and sound from silence, but very little is truly understood in the life world of a newborn. Over time, however, that being learns the symbolic world in which they live. They learn that sounds are actually words. They begin to see faces and recognize them. They learn how to communicate. That life world that society has created shapes the individual behavior of that newborn. Eventually, that newborn is able to give meaning to a variety of symbols and interact with others in the world via communication. It is that ongoing process of meaning given that is important for symbolic interactionists, and it never stops. It doesn't stop when a newborn goes to school, and it doesn't ever stop throughout one's life. We are constantly creating, learning, unlearning, and relearning symbolic worlds around us. Think of how you use your social media versus how, say, your grandparent or older relative uses it. Are there shared or different symbolic worlds that shape how we use new technology? I don't know about you, but if I saw my dad on, say, TikTok, I might have a little bit of a heart attack. A similar, albeit distinct perspective from symbolic interactionism is that of social constructivism or social constructionism. Social constructionism is a sociological research approach that examines the ways in which people interact and create a shared social reality. It is a theory of knowledge that examines the development of community-constructed understandings of the world that form the basis for shared ideas and assumptions about reality. For social constructivists, meanings are developed by social actors in society that shape the society in which we all live. For example, one of the most fundamental constructions is the idea of positive law. Laws that are made by people and establish specific rights for everyone that we are all obliged to respect. If we choose not to follow those laws, we face social punishment, whether that be economic in the form of a fine, social in the form of a loss of status, or punishment in the form of prison. Social constructivists remind us that even our most basic rights and freedoms themselves are social constructions of reality. It is actually a very powerful tool in the sociological toolkit. Social constructivists are the first to tell you that anything in society you think is natural is anything but. That includes law, that includes gender, sexuality, race, and so on. It is all a product of the social system in which we are a part and parcel. This brings us to the final theoretical paradigm that we'll talk about this week: post-structuralism and postmodernism. While some folks argue, and probably for good reason, that these two approaches are distinct, for our purpose we'll explore them together because they do have some common characteristics, and distinguishing them may actually be pretty confusing at this level. No doubt you'll return to these later on in your career, at which point please do treat them as distinct, but for now we'll treat them as one. Postmodernism is a school of thought that denies the validity of sweeping statements about groups of people and analyzes the motives and the consequences of these statements. It is a broad group of theories developed in the mid to late 20th century across social philosophy that moves away from the grand narratives and ideologies associated with perspectives like conflict theory, structural functionalism, and symbolic interactionism. Rather than presenting a singular knowledge claim, like, say, society functions as the result of proper functioning subsystems, a la structural functionalism, or that society functions as the result of conflict, like conflict theorists would, or even that society is produced through collective meaning generated by social actors, like symbolic interactionists. Postmodernists argue that knowledge claims like these are value systems that are socially constructed themselves. Whoa, what the heck does that mean? Well, it means that any claim to truth, even the ones that are more meta, or claim to present a narrative about how society works, are themselves products of political, historical, or cultural discourses, hierarchies, and power relations. We must therefore engage in self-referential critique of any and all claims we make about the system. In other words, we can never disconnect our claims to so-called truth from the broad social structure, the history, and the political and cultural condition in which we live and can make those claims. Sounds pretty pie in the sky, abstract, and relative, doesn't it? Well, critiques of postmodernism critique it for exactly that, as being a meaningless perspective that adds little analytic or empirical knowledge. Proponents of postmodernism, however, maintain that the value of this perspective lies in its ability to reflexively account for how power embeds itself in any and all knowledge claims, and can thus be deconstructed and taken apart like a mechanic takes apart an engine before putting it back together. The postmodern sociologist takes social phenomena apart, looks at it, analyzes it, and puts it all back together. And this process is called deconstruction. And this brings us to post-structuralism. Post-structuralism is a perspective that is related to postmodernism, but looks towards this analytical deconstruction as its main goal. Rather than accepting that society and status quo social relations operate as it should, or as intended, or as a system properly functioning, post-structuralists work to deconstruct the ways in which society structures itself. In other words, rejecting the structural functionalist idea of self-sufficiency, that society is a pre-existing and pre-established collection of structures, post-structuralists instead focus on deconstructing the ways in which that so-called pre-existing social system is built, maintained, and replicated over time. And it does this through deconstructing the claims to truth and knowledge that we make, the ways in which power manifests, and the ways in which authority is embedded throughout the social system. It's pretty abstract. So what I want you all to really remember is that post-structuralism is perhaps best understood at this level as a tool in the sociologist's toolkit. Its focus on deconstructing all social phenomena, from words to laws to ideas to cultures to norms, is what is important. And why do we deconstruct them? Well, to identify the power relations between different actors, to highlight how the system is able to be maintained in such a way that some are able to benefit while others are discriminated against or harmed in a variety of ways. Whew. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed this discussion of social problems. I'll see you all next time on Social Problems.